Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We know folks are still popping in and really appreciate all of you who are here a little early, got to hear a little music. I'm going to go ahead and get us started though, because we have a full hour and a half of content for you. So I don't want to have a late beginning. My name is Connie Silva. I'm the director of the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. And our project and this webinar is brought to you with funding from the California Department of Education. And we do a lot of different technical assistance, PD support for districts that are working to address disproportionality in special education. And today, this is a general webinar, certainly applies to that topic, but applies to anyone doing work on MTSS in general and trying to create more equity for all of our students. So thank you and welcome for joining us. Couple reminders before I introduce our speaker today. We're going to be using chat. So one of the first things I'm going to ask you to do is in chat to go ahead and put your name and the district or what organization that you're with. So again, so we can see all of the people that are joining us. We obviously can't see you on camera, but love to know that you're here in the room with us. We will also be using chat if you have questions, and there may be times when our presenter may ask you to use chat to provide some responses. So just, good for you to get familiar with that. And you'll want to double check that you switch that little blue box to everyone. Otherwise, not everyone will be able to see your chat. So just be sure to do that. Thank you. Nice to see you again. Familiar names and folks that we have been working with, so welcome. And then lastly, you will be asked to participate in polls, so just in case we might be using those for the interactions. So a reminder also that all of our webinars here at SPP-TAP are recorded. This will be archived not only for your future use, so you can take a look if there's certain pieces you want to re-review, but also if you want to share this with others, you are very welcome to after the fact. But we will send information. It's always on our website where you can view them, and it's available to everyone. There's no special passcode or anything like that. Okay, so let's get to our content. I'm very excited today to introduce our presenter. This is Dr. Ambra Green, and anyway, let me tell you a little bit about her. You'll understand why we're so excited. Dr. Green is an associate professor of special education within the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Texas at Arlington. She received her doctorate and served as an assistant research professor at the University of Missouri, Columbia. And Dr. Green is a national scholar with publications and research that's focused on students of colors with and at risk for disabilities, issues related to inequitable school practices, including disproportionality in special education and exclusionary practices, also behavior disorders, positive behavior interventions and supports, and teacher use of evidence-based practices. She's the primary investigator on a personnel preparation grant, which provides rigorous training for master's special education and social work students to support K-12 students with disabilities and high intensity needs. That's funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. And in addition to providing technical assistance at the school, district, and state levels, Dr. Green has provided professional special education consultation in a number of capacities, including for U.S. Senators Roy Blunt and Claire McCaskill, and the Texas Education Agency. Dr. Green also has experience working within OSEP and serves on the OSEP National Technical Assistance Center on PBIS Equity Workgroup. And prior to her higher education, Dr. Green was a middle school special education teacher and PBIS coach. So again, we're very excited to have you here, Dr. Green. I'm going to pass it on to you because I know you have a lot of helpful information to provide everyone that's on our webinar today. Thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you, Connie, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to the California Department of Education and SPP-TAP for this invitation to speak with my fellow educators over on the West Coast. So hello from Texas, and I believe that we should just dive right in and get started. So as a participant in this webinar, you will be able to do a couple of things. One, that you'll be able to discuss amongst yourselves and with me the history of public schooling in the United States as a practice for reflection that we will see how that may or may not inform our current practices. And also as a participant, you'll be able to identify areas of school and or district level improvement within tier 1 practices of MTSS. So we'll be talking about function-based thinking, evidence-based practices. We talk about policy. And so we are going to talk about a lot of things. But first, I want to know your role. I'd like to know who I'm talking to. So there is a poll that will be, that is up on your screen. And I want to know, what is your role in education? Are you an academic or behavior coach, principal or assistant principal, superintendent, general education teacher, special education teacher, or do you have another role within the school system?
Gosh, almost 2/3 of people have responded. We're getting up to 25%. That's fantastic. Just give you another moment to answer. And then I'll share with you the different roles of folks that are joining us today.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see who's here.
Awesome. Okay. So we have academic or behavioral coaches. We have principals and assistant principals, 1% gen ed teacher, and then other. So these other individuals, that's interesting. So either way, I always like to start with that role. So some of you may be from the State Department, California Department of Ed, other things like that, consultants, but I always like to know who I'm talking to so that I can make sure to tailor this discussion. So let's start with a historical context of schooling in America. I like to start here because we want to see where we're going. We want to reflect and see where we are, but also where we may be going. So, you know, there is a nasty history of racism in education. First of all, in the United States, but also that trickled into education and the schooling practices in America, where when we were a slave-based state, where there were enslaved individuals who were mostly kept illiterate, purposely kept illiterate. Their education was forbidden. There were laws that were still that were written predominantly in those southern states that are keeping enslaved individuals from being completely educated. And so then after that, there was about around the 18th to 19th century, there was, you know, freedom of those enslaved individuals. However, while there was freedom from, you know, working on the plantations, they were still afforded a limited educational opportunities for those individuals. Then we move towards like the post-Civil War era, where there was a policies on separate schooling that was in place, segregation, where the poorer schools were there for Black students, also Hispanic students. The schools were poor, they had less resources, and they were segregated, right? So students of color would attend schools for students of color, and white students would attend schools for white individuals. And the idea there was that the students of color, particularly Black children, did not need to go to the white schools. They only needed a basic education. So they didn't need to go to the schools where there were predominantly white individuals to learn higher levels of education, because they only needed the basic skills to survive. Well, we moved towards what we all know of 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and where the Brown versus Board of Education argued for the equal educational opportunities of Black children. The ruling was that that schools that were separate were unequal, and so schools needed to be desegregated. But that ruling was really ignored for the most part until about the 1960s or so. And we know that in the 1960s, we had the Civil Rights Act, where it eliminated segregation in schools, colleges, and jobs based on sex, race, religion, national origin, and many took it as the opportunity to close down the Black schools and to fire the Black teachers. Now, what's interesting about that now is that if we think about our education system, we keep talking about we need to build this pipeline of teachers who are Black teachers, who are Asian teachers, who are Latinx or Latinx individuals. And but if we go back to our history and think about why we don't have some of these races or ethnicities in our schools now, well, it's because those individuals, Black teachers, were fired. And they had to go look for other educational or other jobs. And so that's predominantly, kind of been tradition and, kept going. So, but also, this kind of sets us up for thinking about education now. So if you would reflect upon education now, we have what is called the preschool to prison pipeline, where our preschool children or children earliest preschool are pushed out of school or for whatever reason, and are pushed into a more penal system, or when they get to juvenile justice system and they're more likely to engage in the adult penal system. So it's fashionable nowadays to downplay or even dismiss race as a factor sharing the quality of life in the United States, instead of to favor class-based or gender-based approaches to understanding social oppression. And that is what Garrett Duncan said when he talked about critical race theory and the methodology of that. So if you would, just for a little bit, I want you to think about that quick little history that I gave you and think to yourself this question. If that was happening then, or if that was then, what is happening now? If there was slavery, segregation then, what might be happening now? So just a little time of reflection for you. And I want you to keep this as the foundation of as we move forward, and I walk you through some data and some practices and some common things that we're seeing. If that was then what is now? Well, what's happening across the nation is states are requiring that LEAs will develop a continuous improvement plan. The systems level thinking about what might be happening in their schools. Well, the what that we're going to be talking about today is predominantly about exclusionary practices, but we're not going to stay there at exclusionary practices. We're really going to talk about how academics, how teacher practices, how policies, how our discipline systems lead or all work together in what we see as outcomes or contributors to the preschool to prison pipeline and high rates of exclusionary practices and disproportionality in special education referrals and disproportionality in discipline in general. But first, let me just go ahead and define what I mean when I say exclusionary practices. Exclusionary practices are any time we are removing a student from their typical learning environment or social environment for any period of time in response to an unwanted student behavior, unwanted social behavior. Exclusionary practices have a range of intensity. They range from time out in the classroom, time outside of the classroom, sitting in a buddy room, all the way to what we're most familiar with, which is suspension. So in-school suspension or ISS, out-of-school suspension, OSS, or expulsion. And so while we tend to focus on or disproportionality and disproportionate representation from a state perspective or a federal perspective, largely focuses on those things on like the right end of the spectrum, ISS, OSS, and expulsion. The other end of the spectrum is just as detrimental, because we don't actually know the hours spent when a child is sitting outside in the hallway, or when a child is waiting to be processed by the principal because they've received a office discipline referral. So while we focus a lot of time on, as I said, the right end of the spectrum, we also need to think about how reflection rooms and seclusion rooms and cross-classroom timeouts are also exclusionary practices. So let's look at a little bit of data from California. this is what's happening in the state. Overall, there's overrepresentation in all ethnicities and some more than others. So we see here highlighted are our Hispanic population, or the Hispanic population in California, African-American population in California, and the white population in California. Now, these data are representative of 114 LEAs that have been identified as having significant disproportionality. 31 of those LEAs are new LEAs that have been recently identified as having significant disproportionality, and 83 of these LEAs have had repeat or have repeatedly been identified as having significant disproportionality. But, you know, I want to tell you that you're not in this alone. This is not just the educational system in California. It's not just your LEA, but it's also, unfortunately, the data that we see throughout the nation, that we're continuously not setting up services to support students and to support students equitably. Let's look at some more data here. So in this slide, you can see disaggregation of the data by the element or the indicator for the state, and the LEAs that are identified as having significant disproportionality. So you see indicator 10, which with emotional disturbance, OHI, and specific learning disability. And then you can see the demographics of those student population. So note here that the most frequent races or ethnicities are African-American, white, and Hispanic. And so some people wonder why we need to look at race and ethnicity when there are, for instance, there was the white population for emotional disturbance. So white students have culture too. So it's important that we attend to that. When I do training, sometimes depending on the training that I'm doing, but particularly when I do a culturally responsiveness training, I take the administrators through an activity where they write about their culture. And a lot of times what I see is that our white individuals struggle with the question on the paper or the diagram where they have to draw their culture, because they assume that they don't have a culture, but they do have a culture. And so that is something that it may be the dominant culture. And so if you're not maybe used to, you see culture as other groups, but white individuals have culture too. So just like our students, we need to make sure that we are paying attention to their cultural norms as well. So in general, remember I told you you're not alone in this. So who's most frequently harmed by exclusionary practices? We have quite a bit of individuals, but it's very clear the groups that are most frequently harmed. So we have our students of color, and my students of color, I'm defining that as non-white students, and all non-white students, and those that are Indigenous students. Students with disabilities. Also, there's an intersectionality with that. So students at the intersection of race and ethnicity and disability, and students from low socioeconomic backgrounds and those who are struggling academically are also frequently harmed by exclusionary practices. One thing I always want to make sure to mention when I talk about that last bullet is there is a misconception that students who come from a low socioeconomic background behave in the way that they behave because they're in poverty. So you hear things like, oh, well, that's because the students from that neighborhood, that's why they act that way or behave that way. Or that student is, he's a low socioeconomic student, low SES student. But what the data actually show is that race remains a significant predictor even when we control for poverty. So if we have a Black student and a white student who both come from have a low socioeconomic background, race tends to be the predictor, or is the significant predictor for what student will receive an exclusionary practice, and it's the Black student. So I want to make sure to point out that misconception. So there is a cyclical relationship between behavior and academics. It's kind of like the chicken and the egg question. What comes first? Is it the behavior or it's the academics? If it's the behavior, this is what we tend to think, or this is what happens. A student engages in some type of undesired behavior. That undesired behavior is met with some type of exclusionary practice. You can see here it's exclusion where the student is outside the door. So that yields missed instruction time, which then yields students falling behind academically, which then yields academic gaps. And then the cycle continues and it goes on and on. But also there's a scenario in which students may be behind academically. They may be trying to communicate a need, but are not communicating that need appropriately. That maybe they're having trouble reading, they're having trouble writing. And then they engage in some type of undesired behavior that leads them to miss class or instruction time. They fall behind even more academically. We see these academic gaps and they're just further and further behind. And then they behave in a certain manner. So we really don't know what's happening, the chicken or the egg, right, conversation, but we still know we're able to, as educators, intervene in either area. If students are behind academically, we know how to support them. Also, if students are engaging in undesired behaviors, we know how to support them too. We teach behaviors just like we teach academic skills. So there is harm or potentially harm when students are engaged in high rates of exclusionary practices. First, the students miss the good stuff, right? What they're there for, they're in the school for anyway. Academics, they miss social skill building time. They miss the opportunity to mess up friendships and then learn how to build those friendships back. Same thing with the relationships with the teachers. They miss the opportunity to work out whatever issue that may have happened between the student and the teacher. They miss being a part of a larger learning community. And this is something that I think we may all be able to now empathize with, that we might not have been able to empathize with before. But even, I'm such an introverted person, and I'm not fond really of meetings and things like that. But during the pandemic, when I was, at home for long periods of time without socializing with my colleagues and coworkers other than just on Teams, I kind of miss being part of a larger learning community. So I can sympathize or empathize, and I hope you can too, with our children who are excluded often and, hearing about things going on with their peers in the learning environment, and they're hardly ever there. But we also have different ways of excluding students that we sometimes don't think about. The curricula, if the curricula is not culturally responsive, we could be excluding students. So students are reading about things that they don't relate with. They're engaging in tasks and opportunities that they don't relate with. They don't understand why it's happening or why this is done in a certain way. And so with not using these culturally responsive practices, that's another way of excluding students from the environment. Maybe unintentionally, maybe intentionally. And so, as I mentioned, the students not seeing themselves as a larger learning environment. If you imagine just being in an area where nothing is familiar, the rules and expectations aren't familiar, the behavioral norms aren't familiar, and you're constantly getting kind of called on or called out about doing something one way, which you typically think is right? So students, that's another way in which students can be excluded. These things lead to school failure, dropout, substance abuse, later possible incarceration, a decrease of enrollment in post-secondary education. And also, schools have lower school-wide achievement and perceptions of school safety. And this is true for the student body as well as the teachers. So teachers have reported that teachers and students who have not received or didn't receive exclusionary practices reported that when they have a more punitive school environment, they feel less safe. Whether or not it's them that are being, excluded, but they feel less safe when the school environment is more punitive. And then suspension and expulsion simply just doesn't teach. It actually leads to more undesired behaviors that may be, that can lead to behaviors that are socially inappropriate, and behaviors that are typically have like a coercive, I would say a coercive characteristic. Also, I want to make sure that we talk about our emerging bilingual students. So nationally, in the state of California, emerging bilingual students do not receive disproportionate rates of out-of-school suspension. So that's a good thing. Good thing nationally, good thing for the state. Just caution here that you should look at your LEA data and make sure that in your LEA that this is the case as well. So this is just another group that we want to make sure to pay attention to. The federal special education law regarding monitoring of disproportionality doesn't address emerging bilingual students, but you should. And that is actually, by doing that, you are actually being equitable. You are actually implementing an equitable practice that is not required of you by the state. So it's going beyond just being compliant and complicit and doing what the state requires, and it's showing an equitable activity for a student group that needs a little more attention. So again, after all these data that I have shown you, I'm gonna just make sure to ground us back into that conversation about, if that was then, what's happening now? And ask, has the historical goal of schooling in America prevailed? Where the historical goal was to keep a certain group of individuals, behind and uneducated, and whatever, maybe at that time explicitly, maybe explicitly, what do you think? So to what extent, you see here in your poll question, you can select an answer, to what extent do you still see remnants of the historical educational structure in your school or site?
Just about 50% of our participants have responded, so we'll give another few seconds to let the rest of you respond if you would like to. Okay, let's share the results of this information. And here's what we see.
All right. So about 21% of you said very much so that it's still, that you see it happening, or that, the extent of the remnants of the historical education structure. About 40% said quite a bit, 35 some, 40% not as much, and about 1% not at all. All right, good. So let's keep on talking. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. So now let's start talking about our foundational practices. Let's look at our tier 1 practices that we are going to discuss moving forward. First, we're going to discuss culturally responsive and anti-racist practices in curricula, academic curricula, our social skill curricula, our social emotional learning curricula as well. Okay, making sure that that's culturally responsive and anti-racist. We're also going to talk about some evidence-based practices that should be implemented with equity. So we'll talk about function-based thinking here and some classroom management, monitoring of instructional practices. And then we will talk about policies and student codes of conduct. So let's start here with our culturally responsive practices. I want to make sure that I am providing you with common terminology. So you may hear cultural competence, you may hear culturally responsive practices, culturally relevant practices, culturally sustaining pedagogy. And really, as a beginner, the heart of this is that we want to address the cultures in our classroom. So I don't want us to get stuck on, is it culturally competent or is it culturally sustaining, where we can dig deeper into that. But culturally responsive practices in general is just that we want to make sure that we are bringing in the cultures of our students, but also I love this definition of Grant and Ray from Grant and Ray, where they say, instead of viewing culture as a description of a group of people, perhaps a more useful approach for educators is to think of culture as the lens through which people, or our students, view the world based on their backgrounds and their experiences. Oftentimes, the idea of implementing culturally responsive practices is heavy on our shoulders, because we're thinking that these culturally responsive practices, that we have to be fluent in every culture, and every culture that's depicted in our classroom and outside of our classroom. But really, if we ascribe to this type of view of culture as looking at the individual child and seeing from their viewpoint the world based on their background and experiences, it becomes a less daunting task for us, where we're not having to be, fluent in all cultures and all different ethnicities. I'm certainly not. And so I can just understand how maybe some educators may think that they have to be, and that's not the case, especially if we're ascribing to this definition. But I want to also point out that being culturally responsive will only address part of the problem. We also have to be anti-racist and engage in anti-racist practices. So for anti-racist, that means we are not racist. So a racist would be, according to Ibram Kendi, a racist practice or a racist individual would be one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction, or expressing a racist idea. So for us to be anti-racist, we have to be one who's supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. And again, this is from Ibram Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So I think about it this way. When I think about the difference between culturally responsive practices and anti-racism, I think about a house. I think about if I wanted to, if I wanted to change something about my house, I can choose to remodel the house, which means I'm going to tear down a couple of walls. I'm going to knock down, a couple of counters, and I might replace them. I might, change some different lighting, but for the most part, I'm going to keep the bones of the house. I'm going to, the frame is likely the majority of the frame, unless I'm building another part of the house, the frame is going to stay there. That's what's holding my system up. So I think about that. And then I think about something else, which is just completely tearing down the house. And I tear down or I demolish my current home, and then I just rebuild on top of that land. I get rid of that framework, I get rid of that junk, and I rebuild on that land. And that's how I see that's how I kind of conceptualize culturally responsive practices and anti-racism. Because in culturally responsive practices, when I go into an already built school, having an already built frame or system, I am then implementing culturally responsive practices to deal with, which means I'm repainting walls, I'm rehanging the lighting, I'm putting down new countertops, but which makes it look good. It's great. It does what I want it to do, but I'm still operating within this framework of a house that may not be the framework that I want to be operating in. And so sometimes when we implement culturally responsive practices, we still have the framing of systemic racism in our school that we're competing against, right, when we're trying to instruct our students in a culturally responsive manner. So anti-racism to me is where we knock down the system, We knock down those walls that are keeping things, the structure, the systemic structure, systemic racism, and then we can implement culturally responsive practices in an anti-racist frame. Okay, so I hope that that helps you to understand the difference and the use of CRP and anti-racist approaches. But also, so that again, that's tier one. We're still talking about tier one. Also in tier one practices, it's important that in our schools, for our teachers, for our educators, that we have them assess their ethnocentrism. Where, you know, in schools where we have, where ethnocentrism exists, perceived desired behaviors, example, staying out of trouble, how to bring honor to the school, receiving good grades, how to communicate with your peers or your teacher. That is associated with students in the same group or a culture as the teacher. So that's where when ethnocentrism exists. The teacher thinks one way, and the teacher thinks that the student should behave in that same way. Whereas perceived undesired behaviors, what's, you know, distracting or disruption, or so students dress or being disrespectful, or students untidy, that's associated with students that are not a part of the same culture or group as that teacher. So if our teacher is operating in their own ethnocentrism, they may perceive a student's behavior as undesired because it is not the same as what the teacher ascribes to in that teacher's culture. So ethnocentrism comes from, or is a form of Eurocentrism is a form of ethnocentrism, which basically just lays the importance of the Western or the European way of life at the cost of, as being more predominant and more purposeful at the cost of other cultures. And a lot of times our curricula are Eurocentric. The textbooks that we choose, the reading books that we choose, the activities, the test questions, all of that tends to be very Eurocentric. And as I mentioned earlier, right, sometimes our students don't see themselves in that curriculum, and that's a way of being pushed out as well. So our schools continue to teach with these Eurocentric curriculums that and where the work of Black and Indigenous individuals and other non-white individuals are not given much, if any, importance in the curricula about, you know, how the White House was built, who built the White House, other things of that nature, where the full history and factual history is not being taught or valued. So this also kind of goes with the idea that what you tend to probably hear often is that I don't see race. I don't see color, and therefore, if I don't see color, I see color and understand how it can make people's everyday and life experiences different from mine, is more of the approach that we want to ascribe to. If someone can't acknowledge racial issues and they say that they can't see culture, they don't see culture, sometimes, they don't see color. Sometimes it means that they don't see the individual. They don't see the struggles that they have to go through on a daily basis. They don't have to worry about some of the things that other individuals are privileged to consider. For instance, just, you know, I had a talk with a colleague the other day talking about Band-Aids, about, you know, how she may be able to walk into a Band-Aid and walk into a store and find Band-Aids that are her skin color, and I may not. Pantyhose, makeup, what have you, you know, from the day-to-day experiences all the way to the educational experiences as well. So what can we do about that? As educators, at the tier 1 level, we have to always make sure that we are incorporating materials from all ethnic groups, not just the groups that are representative in your classroom, but all. This should be we should have a global perspective when it comes to exemplars in our classroom. A lot of times we see see the same individuals over and over. So a quick, Google search, I was able to find some scientists that may look like me or may look like students in my classroom. So sure, teach them about Albert Einstein, teach them about Isaac Newton, because that's important. That's history. But also teach them about Alfredo Ayala, who is a holder of 10 patents. He's part of a team of artists and scientists and engineers that designed Disney's leading edge theme park. Okay, he's a Hispanic individual. Or Dr. Jacobs Young. She's the first African-American to earn a PhD in wood and paper science and engineering. She's female. She is African-American. So, this doesn't take a long time. Our curricula builders can provide some additional supports if our curricula that is designed by the state does not have any type of diversity or representation. Our curriculum support staff should be able to help the teachers identify some more diverse individuals until those who are making our curricula or do a better job, or until we hire some people to change the curriculum and implement a better curriculum. Because our young children continuously internalize messages about race, gender, religion, language, sexual orientation, and they receive messages of discrimination from multiple sources all the time: media, movies, social media, home, their peers. So as a teacher at the tier 1 level, we need to make sure that we're counteracting these messages, and that requires intense, targeted, and continuous efforts to be done. And so that's why I bring forward the idea of having our academic instructional coaches and curriculum writers assist with this to lessen the burden on teachers, and they can be more creative in how our students learn. Too often, our families of color have had negative experiences with the school, whether it be with the books that they're reading, as far as like the textbooks, and how maybe individual groups are being portrayed as either antagonists or protagonists illegitimately. They've had negative experiences with schooling in general, have been invited to meet with professionals or with the administrator. They have historically negative experiences. And so it's just important that we make sure to be purposeful in counteracting these approaches. So I want to just show you, or make sure that you have the opportunity to read this comic, because it's very interesting. And unfortunately, this child had to do their own research, or parents had to help them subsidize, provide subsequent literature for what they were currently reading. So basically, the child brought in another textbook to counteract what the teacher or the curriculum was teaching them about Christopher Columbus and the land. Also, just practice making sure that the materials that are provided are representative. And so our classroom libraries, and our just school-based libraries, also have different individuals there. They're a diverse collection. And that's our just a bare minimum first step that we do. But I do want to make sure that I point out that we want to make sure that we are not encouraging or just perseverating stereotypes. So just by putting up a book of the story of Cesar Chavez, Harvesting Hope, just because that is Hispanic, it was a Mexican man, we need to provide other narratives, right? As I mentioned earlier, like Alfredo Ayala was also a scientist. You can be a scientist, or you have the option of being a harvester and a farmer. Both great things, but we don't want to paint a single picture of one group of individuals. Our Black individual, we don't want to just have that, that they are sports figures. So we don't want to always have a LeBron James book only, right? We need other books. We have President Obama. We have other books that can be brought forth to show the diversity. A book, about a teacher of a different ethnicity. I remember growing up, we only had that one Michael Jordan poster in the library, right? And that's all we saw. Michael Jordan, Black man, athletics, great, but I never saw a Black teacher or anything else depicted in my classroom library. So representation matters, and we just want to make sure that our communication around that is clear. Okay, so we've talked about what's happening. We've talked about what we can do at the tier 1 level as far as culturally responsive practices. Let's also think about function-based, or talk about function-based practices and evidence-based practices. But first, before you get into that, I want to engage you in a chat. So answering this question, what consequences would you apply to the student that likes to make the class laugh?
We know it takes a little time to think through these questions and answer them. So we'll give you a little silence. Don't worry. We're here and watching what you're saying. And Dr. Ambra Green will respond to your comments in a moment.
Let me pull up my chat here. All right. So what consequences would you apply to the student that likes to make the class laugh? Good. Okay. Okay. So I'm seeing basically incorporating the opportunity for the joke, a scheduled time for that, provide behavioral feedback. I'd use that skill to support the instruction. I would laugh also, which that was totally me as a teacher. Sometimes we think we have to be on a strict schedule. So sometimes it's funny. But sometimes it happens all the time. And so someone said, why do there need to be consequences? In quotes. Give him an assignment to present to the class on a favorite subject. If you need the attention, you can come and help me teach. Give the student time to shine. Teach time and place. Good, provide attention. All right, okay, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about function-based thinking. Strategy 1. I would say that, and I do say that when I talk to LEAs or administrators, I always tell them that if there was one strategy that I wanted all my faculty, all my teachers to know, general ed and special education, the one strategy I would make sure they knew very well was function-based thinking. So let's talk about that. Function-based thinking relies on the key principles of behavior. It's a applied behavior analysis focus, but the key principles are that human behavior, student behavior, child behavior, teenage behavior, adult behavior, your behavior is predictable, it's changeable, and it's functional. It's not good or bad. It's predictable, changeable, and functional. And their behavior, student behavior, is functionally related to the teaching environment. So what do I mean by that? I mean that students learn, and again, we're just talking about students here because this is education, but this is human behavior. Students learn through repeated experiences that under these set of circumstances, what we call antecedent behavior or antecedent conditions, if I engage in this particular behavior, whatever the behavior is, I can expect this consequence. So let's talk about this is called the ABC or 3-term contingency. So let's talk about this. The A, again, is the antecedent. It's the conditions or the circumstances that increase the probability of a certain behavior to occur. It is what happens immediately before the behavior occurs that sets the occasion for the behavior to actually occur. This can be the physical setting. This could be the fact that I'm going to math class and I hate it. This could be, I know someone who's going to be in this class, so there's people present. It could be the clarity or not clarity of unclear expectations. But basically, the antecedents produce or they impact whatever behavior there is to follow. Behavior is anything that's observable and is measurable. And it's what the student does, the actions or reactions to the antecedent, what came before it. And then, so with the behavior, it can be an example of the student is doing something that's as instructed, or they're doing anything other than what is actually instructed. And then we have C, the consequence. Now, the consequence is the resulting event or outcome that occurs immediately following the behavior, and it impacts the future occurrence of the behavior. So I always have to pause here and make sure to define consequence clearly and give you a non-example. A non-example of consequence is punishment. Consequence does not mean punishment. Consequence just means whatever happens after the behavior occurs, and typically it has an impact on the future rate of the occurrence. So consequence does not mean punishment. It's what immediately occurs, follows the behavior. So there's a teacher reaction and or the peer reaction. There is informal social interaction. So in our case earlier, may have been students laughing. There's positive feedback or correction may occur. It may be delivering of a sticker. The teacher gives the student the sticker after engaging in a socially acceptable or desired behavior. So that could be a consequence, okay? So let's look here at this Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. So Calvin says, "Hey Susie, pick a number in the fortune teller." She says, 3. He says, 1, 2, 3, now pick a letter. She says, B. Then he says, we lift up flat B, and it says, you're a mouth-breathing bag of boogers. Ah, ha, ha, ha. And then he says, life doesn't get much better than this. Well, we're implying here that Susie hit him, kicked him. I don't know, his shoes are over here, right? It looks like his little flipper here is crunched up. But he's still saying life doesn't get much better than this. So there's something that happened there, and we would typically think that maybe this is not the outcome that a student would want, right? That they end up on the floor with their shoes off and they're, on their bottom. So what happened? Well, here's another example. In the antecedent, the teacher tells the students that they will begin partner reading. The behavior, Alana, the student, puts her head on her desk. The consequence, the teacher tells Alana, either you pick your head up or you go into the hallway if you're not going to participate like everyone else. Well, Alana goes into the hallway. What has Alana learned? Alana has learned that under this condition, when the teacher says it's time to begin partner reading, I can put my head down and I can go into the hallway and not have to do the task. So Alana learned how to escape the behavior through this cycle of ABCs. So we have to ask ourselves, why do students do these behaviors? What function do they serve? And it's either to get something or to avoid or escape something. The something could be attention. It could be from peers or teacher, or it could be something could be a tangible item, the iPad, more computer time, more recess time. Or it can be sensory. So sometimes self-stimulatory behaviors falls underneath that category. But again, as I mentioned, this is the strategy that I would make sure that teachers know. So there is the IRIS Center is funded by the OSEP, Office of Special Education Programs, and it has a training for anyone, really, if you sign up for it. And I believe it's free training. Actually, I know it is free training. And it takes teachers through the functional behavior assessment process. Teachers, gen ed teachers, I wouldn't say necessarily, it's not a must that they know how to conduct an FBA, but they do need to understand function-based thinking, which is what I described. They don't have to really know how to go through the paperwork and things like that, but it would be a good opportunity. But also, you have experts in your LEAs. You have special educators who likely have been trained in this because they go through a special education program. You have school psychologists that may be able to assist in this. So it's behavioral coaches that may have been trained to do this. So it's identifying those supports, those personnel who have the experience, the expertise that can provide those trainings. So again, though, the function of behavior is also meaning the why, the root cause of the behavior. What purpose is the behavior serving for the student? What's the payoff for the student? What is the student getting or trying to avoid from engaging in this behavior? What's the most important thing that the student wants to gain or avoid by using this behavior? Okay, so again, you have specialists and individuals who are trained that can help you do that, especially if you're looking to reduce undesired or high rates of exclusionary practices. But we don't want to stay there, right? You can identify the function of a student's behavior. Who cares? Like, what is that going to actually do that you can identify it? Well, if teachers can identify the functions of behavior, then they can implement function-based interventions that are also evidence-based, and then that can lead to decreased rates of undesired behaviors. So, if we train our general education teachers, I say that predominantly general education because our SPED teachers tend to have this training. If we can train them to identify functions, then we can also educate them on how to implement function-based interventions that are also evidence-based and can lead to those decreased rates of undesired behaviors. So here's an example of how that can occur. Teacher tells the class to line up to walk down the hallway. Jaime walks zigzag outside of the line and makes a popping noise with his mouth. Consequence, teacher says, Jaime, that is not appropriate hallway behavior. In the next transition, Jaime does it again. What has he learned? Jaime has learned that if I engage in this certain set of circumstances, I'm going to get the teacher's attention, right? So what the teacher would do is, still using that same 3-term contingency, would teach hallway expectations and establish them and establish those expectations, write them out, and then teach them to the students, to the class. Jaime will likely engage in those behaviors that were taught. He keeps his voice quiet, body to self, walks on the right side of the hallway as he was taught by the teacher. And then the teacher provides Jaime with what he wanted to begin with. The teacher says, excellent job following hallway expectations, Jaime. If Jaime's function was to get teacher attention, he got it, right? Just in a more appropriate and desired way. So that's the whole idea behind function-based thinking, is helping teachers identify the function and teaching the students how to get their function met, their communication need met, but in an appropriate way. We all do that as humans too. So going back to the chat, let's redo it. What consequences would you apply if many of you kind of have the correct answer, but what consequences would you apply to the student that likes to laugh, that likes to make the class laugh? And we are answering in the chat. Let me put my chat back up. Thanks, Susan, for putting that link in there. All right, would any of you change your answers? If you would have the same answer, just put same answer. Do you have a different answer? I see, I think it's Carissa. No consequences. We need laughter right now in this world. See that from earlier. No need for consequence. The word tends to bring a negative feel. Yeah, it does. But so that's why I make sure that we're that I'm changing, help shift that paradigm between what consequence really means and what it doesn't mean. Good point. And yes, his ability to make people laugh is an asset. I would agree. So a lot of you have same answer. Give a student a specific time. Good. Similar answer, consider timing. Yeah. Revisit, reteach class norms as the antecedent. Good. Just some lessons on differences. Okay. All right, good. So thank you for participating in that. One other thing that I want to make sure to say about function-based thinking is I know a lot of times we say that we want to give teachers lots of tools in their toolbox. And sure, that's good. But if there was one tool, I would say it is function-based thinking, and it's because of this. If a teacher is engaging in multiple types of, and actually I'll keep it here, and students are engaging in undesired behavior, teachers tend to go to their toolbox first and pull out something to see if it works. And then it doesn't work, so then they go back to the toolbox, see if it works. And it doesn't, and they're going back and forth playing this game with the toolbox. If the teachers understood function-based thinking, identify the function, teach the appropriate way to get their function met, and then meet the function, that's one strategy guaranteed to work the first time, and we can move on about our business. So here it's kind of like mopping up. That's what I'm saying. Like, we're using a tool where we have a mop, and that's a great tool, but it might not be helpful for the carpet, right? If we're still going to leave some residue in that carpet if there's a spill. So anyways, the whole point behind that is to make sure to have a more efficient strategy. Okay. All right. Our next strategy here is evidence-based practices, just general evidence-based practices. And I'm going to walk you through a study that I conducted that you or anyone can do. So you see here the definition of the study. And what we did basically is we went into classrooms, about 23, 24 teachers' classrooms, and we did observations in their language during their language arts direct instruction. The average time of instruction, so it's about 4.5 hours per teacher. And we collected data on target students and all students in the classroom. You can see here the demographics of the teachers. And again, what we did to find the target students for the teachers is we gave them a screener called the systematic screener for behavior disorders. And we asked teachers to rank their students, and they used that screener to identify what students or students who might be at risk for receiving a referral for special education services because of undesired behaviors. So our students were predominantly male students, predominantly Black male students, and you can see the range of grades here for the participating students who were identified as target students. Here's their mean scores for that screener. So the mean was for a critical event score was 3.6, adaptive ability scores was 33. 0.85, and then the maladaptive student behavior score was 32.7. We looked at several evidence-based practices. One, opportunity to respond. We looked at pre-correction, and we looked at positive specific feedback as well. And then we also looked at some non-evidence-based practices, such as negative interactions with students and neutral interactions with students. And those were limited just to those interactions that were verbal or gestural. And the best part of this study is we used this fancy data collection tool here, which was really, it's a Word document, and we put in some cells, and we did a frequency count. So if a teacher used an OTR or positive specific feedback, pre-correction, and so on, and then who the teacher used it with, was it the whole group? Was it target student 1, that's the T1, target student 2, target student 3? And then we did a little demographic and variability. WM means white male, then there's white female, black female, Latinx male, and you don't see the Latinx female there, or Latina. Because that was the population of the classrooms in that school. But anyway, anytime a teacher would engage in one of those practices, we would just do a tally mark and continue to do tally marks for the 30-minute individual observations. And we did that all the way up to about 4.5 hours. So our first question was, do general education teachers implement evidence-based practices compared to the rates that are recommended in the literature? Those recommended rates there are on your right side of the screen. We started with so recommended rates for OTR is anywhere from 3 to 5. It just depends on how you're implementing them and when in the instructional period, but we went with 3 per minute. And unfortunately, none of the teachers' OTR met the recommended rate of 3 per minute during those observation minutes. All teachers had rates that were about less than 1 per minute. For positive specific feedback, unfortunately, the same occurs. We looked at a 4 per minute to 1, 4 to 1 ratio. And the teachers there in green and with that also have asterisks had at least a positive ratio. So like teacher 19 almost hit the 4 to 1 ratio, but our other teachers that are not highlighted here actually have the inverse relationship, had an inverse ratio where there were a lot more negative interactions than positive interactions in that classroom. So I highlight teacher 21, teacher 8, teacher 6. And then for pre-corrections, the range of use of pre-corrections was 0.03 to 0.14. And here in the research, we don't really have a standard for how often pre-corrections should occur. But pre-corrections are anytime you're correcting you're anticipating that a student may engage in an undesired behavior, and you go ahead and pre-correct. For instance, I would say, we're getting ready to line up. Please make sure that you push in your chair and you walk to the door, because I'm anticipating students are just going to get up and start running to the door. So I provide a pre-correction so that I don't later have to provide a negative interaction or reprimand them. So these kinds of pre-corrections should be happening all the time, but even still, they were very, very low overall. We also asked if the rate of opportunity to respond varied as a function of race or risk status. Remember, our students who were identified at risk by that screener, or the intersection of that. And what we found is that students not at risk receive more opportunities to respond than students at risk. And that is a key there, because we know if students are at risk, we need to be providing more opportunities for them to engage in the instruction. That would be equitable. But we're seeing here inequities because our students not at risk were receiving more opportunities to respond than our students at risk. Same data here for our positive specific feedback. The students who were at risk for receiving referrals for special education for behavior disorders received less positive specific feedback than the students who were not at risk for receiving that. So poll question, what might these results communicate?
So you can see on the poll that there are several answers. I'll read those aloud to you just to give you another way of hearing them. Some students are not receiving access to evidence-based practices. The lack of evidence-based practices may be contributing to undesired behaviors in the classroom. The lack of evidence-based practices may be contributing to inequitable discipline in practices. of discipline practices, and teachers may not know what evidence-based practices are or may not know how to use them. You should be able to choose as many of those as you think are the correct answers. And about 20% of you have answered. We'll give you a little bit more time since there's lots to read and think about. Getting close to 50% of participants responding. So just a couple more seconds. Okay, let's see what those results are. Just one moment. And there you see the results.
All right, thank you. So the answer is all of these can be true. You know, that basically students aren't, the students that needed the support, as I mentioned, were not receiving support to receiving support, or they weren't receiving those evidence-based practices. And that's so critical because we know that those particular evidence-based practices work. And by work, I mean they increase students' academic attainment and success, and they reduce undesired behaviors, or the presence of undesired behaviors. So if we want to see less undesired behaviors in our classrooms, then we need to see teachers using those evidence-based practices at the rate in which they've been proven to decrease undesired behaviors and excel children's academic skills. So oh goodness, sorry, I'm a little pause here for a little bit. Let me go back here. So this is, or what those results showed was an issue of not equality, but equity, right? Because we had our students there who were engaged, or those students who were identified as being at risk, and they are the students who needed those practices more than any of the other students. So back to our discussion, or our comment earlier about what happens. Is it the behavior or the academic first? You know, we don't really know, but we can still use those tier 1 evidence-based practices to address either one of those things. So we need to think about our service delivery model. How are students receiving services? Students who may have been, who may have been in school suspension or out of school suspension. How are they receiving their missed work? What student groups are not receiving equitable services? And that's important because we need to make sure that our implementation of school-wide and district-wide approaches, and that we have pre-referral interventions, that there's co-teaching at the tier 1 practices, that there's versus just a classroom assistant there, that there's a focus on behavior and academics. So it's all very important, and that there's an all means all teaming approach. So here are just a couple examples or more practices that we should see at the tier 1 level that I didn't talk about explicitly. All right, so let's move here to, is it an issue of our procedures and our policy alignment? A lot of times we say that we are ascribing to a certain practice, and yes, we are in theory, but is that actually written down? Because sometimes that there's a misalignment. So I want to ask you here to put in the chat what you believe is the purpose of a student code of conduct or discipline policies. And because I know that this can be kind of lengthy, what I'm going to do is just let you chat amongst yourselves about that, and you can see one another's answers. So earlier, and what I'm going to tell you is after there's a 100-year history of discipline policies, where there was a school safety study that came about that yielded the largest shift towards the needs for written policies because of different types of violence that was happening in the schools. And we were seeing a lot of weapons on campus. There was a Columbine incident and tragedies. And so then the National School Resource Network moved towards published guidelines on developing effective codes of conduct for discipline. So the earlier perceptions of discipline policies was that it was a positive way of providing clear guidelines for behavior that would likely result in the consistent and equitable application of rules while making schools safer. That was the idea. And then we started adding things like zero tolerance policies because of the Gun-Free Schools Act, and where it was first zero tolerance for weapons only, but then it moved towards zero tolerance for any ambiguous behavior that we just didn't want to deal with in our schools. And so that has tremendously led toward a shift in what we thought the reason was for policies. We've moved away from that positive, clear guidelines, wanting schools to be safer, to a more punitive approach. So I want to show you a couple examples of a policy work that you can use as a resource. The PBIS Equity Work Group members developed, several of them developed different data guides to be useful for schools and LEAs who were experiencing significant disproportionality. One of those data guides is the key elements of policies, right here, to address discipline disproportionality. It's a guide for district and school teams. And so what a group, in and of itself, it's a great policy guide, and it's kind of been extended to the checklist for addressing discipline policies and procedures for equity. And they may be putting that in the chat again here. It was at the beginning of the session as resources, but it's here for you as well. But this CADP is a 47 question checklist to be able to answer some things about, allow you to go through your policies and answer some questions about those policies. And it's based on the earlier version of the policy guide that was created by the PBIS work group members. But it has questions such as these. There's element 3, which is focusing on implementing positive proactive behavior support practices. And so they have questions that are asking, are your policies positive? Are they proactive? Are they, do you have an actual practice in that policy? So when we reviewed 142 district discipline policies, we used this CADP to ask, to see what was in their policies. So one of the questions that we asked was, is there still a zero tolerance or an automatic suspension policy mentioned as a practice? And out of that 142 districts that we looked at their policies, 75% still had a zero tolerance policy in there. And so we said, okay, so if there's a zero tolerance policy still there, is there clear communication that the suspension or the expulsion is only limited to behaviors that pose a credible threat for safety? And 87%, no, there was not any guidelines that you only use those zero tolerance policies for that. And so again, that's just an example of how you can use that CADP to review your discipline policies. One thing I did want to mention though is that when we looked and we asked our research question about how effective this was for the districts who we analyzed, what we found is that the higher scores that the district received on that CADP correlated with a decreased risk ratio for exclusionary discipline with students without disabilities, and the higher scores on that CADP correlated with decreased risk ratios for exclusionary discipline practices for students with disabilities that identified as Hispanic, African American, Native American. So I would really suggest that you look at that that discipline or that CADP to revise your policies and to see how positive, how proactive those policies actually are. The guidebook, that CADP also helps to assist with seeing and looking at the foundational and best practices of policy development. Is it accessible? Does it have pro-social behaviors? Is there a focus on equity? A lot of times, our policies are not accessible to our students. Our students can't read them. It is written in language that is legalese. And so it's hard for our students, our teachers, our family members to even read them. And it's very unfortunate. So how can we hold students and families accountable to our student code of conduct and it's not accessible language? Also, does it focus on pro-social behaviors? So is there the traditional approach is that it highlights and defines undesired behaviors, but forward thinking is that it highlights and defines desired behaviors that are district-wide. It talks about reinforcing and reteaching strategies as well. And also, are the policies unbiased? Is there equity in the decision-making process, and is that used as a guiding principle behind the examples that are in your policy guide? So I want to show you here another example of how some policies can move from just being compliant to exemplary. So this is just a policy here in Texas, a Senate bill policy that relates to removing a public school student from the classroom due to some type of conduct, okay? Some guiding questions that you might ask yourself is how the definition of, for instance, for this policy, harassment operationalized in your school? How does the school or district safeguard against bias towards already marginalized groups of students? And to what extent does your school or district provide training on culturally competent and culturally relevant practices? So let me show you an example of how you can move through, again, compliance to a more exemplary policy. This is just the compliance statement of the policy. The policy said that a student may be removed, or the education code said a student may be removed from a classroom as a result of an alleged harassment against a teacher or other district employee and placed in a district alternative education program, which is what we have here in Texas. And so literally the district can lift this policy out of the educator code and put it into their student code of conduct. And that's what we see all the time. But a recommended approach to that is, yes, we have the compliance and we meet that standard, but we also consider things such as mitigating factors. Was there self-defense? What was the intent of the student's behavior? What's the student age or their disciplinary history? Do they have a disability? This might have been a culturally related behavior. Also, if these mitigating factors are there, then the district alternative education placement might be removed as a consequence, and other alternatives can be in place. So that's a step above looking at equity. Let's see if we can move further. Moving further would be, if then we have to assign a district alternative education placement or an exclusionary practice, then we should at least make sure that there's a reentry plan that takes care of teaching the behavioral expectations and restorative practices that's co-created by the district staff, the parents and guardian, and the students for when it is time for the student to actually move back into the school placement. So I want to show you another example. This is from Jackson, Mississippi. This was their 2015-2016 code of conduct. In their intervention strategies for teachers, they actually put in their student code of conduct these evidence-based practices, and you can see highlighted here. They talk about reteaching the school-wide expectations. They talked about social acknowledgement, which is another word for positive specific feedback or praise statements. It's directly embedded into their policy so that it is clear that they're not just saying that they ascribe to a certain theory of behavior, a positive preventative approach to behavior, or PBIS, but their policy also shows that they do. And a lot of times there's misalignment between, or there's not alignment between what we say we do and implement and what's actually in our policies. Here's more. They talk about possible functions of behavior written into their policy. They put in that minimum of 4:1 praise to correction feedback in the policy. Group contingency and classroom incentives, that's positive specific feedback or praise as well. Reviewing the student's academic placement. Is the student in their least restrictive environment? Right? Is that actually the place where they are, or should they be there? Identify the student's interests and incorporate their interests. And that all goes to culturally responsive practices, just another way of saying that. So my recommendation is, when you are looking at your policy and your policy development, policy redevelopment, realignment, that you develop a team. That you can call it an equity team, that's fine, but you develop a team that is racially diverse, ethnically diverse, has gender diversion, culture, religion, diverse team, and you start there, but you don't stop there, because really we want to make sure that equity is within the foundation of MTSS work. And so if we only have an equity team, that sits outside of the foundation. So what we want is that our equity team is really just our regular leadership team that does what is supposed to be done anyway and all the time. So again, I would say that the things that we talked about here today, culturally responsive and anti-racist practices, looking about and monitoring the use of evidence-based practices and making sure they're implemented with equity, and revisiting those policies will get you to a place where you are starting to demolish your systems and then rebuilding a system that's based on culturally responsive practices, anti-racist practices, equity, equity in curricula, equity in the use of practices, and our policies. And our policies are aligned with our theoretical philosophy of education and our practices. So if there are any questions, I can answer that now. And I will look into the chat to see if there are any questions. But I don't see any. And it also looks like slides and handouts were resent again. So at this time, I believe that is it.
Well, thank you. I'm seeing just appreciative comments of appreciation in chat. And yes, I love how much you were able to cover in this hour and a half. It's a lot of information. Again, we made sure that people have the PowerPoints so you can review them as well. And as I said, it's archived, so you'll be able to view whatever you missed or whatever you want to review again. You see the slide says your feedback. We do quickly want to get a quick poll that's going to be put up. And this is anonymous, so we won't know who's responded how, but it's important for us to know how well this met your needs. So we do ask a few questions. You'll see the first one is, how useful was this webinar, and what aspects or components of the webinar were most beneficial? And you can actually type into that, so it's not just a yes, no type answer. Those last three, also, how might future webinars be improved? And then the last one, on what topics would you like more information or training? So we put that up there so that you can answer right now. And then when we send a follow-up email, you won't have to worry about it. It's done. But we really appreciate not only having Dr. Green here, but also having your feedback on how well this met the needs that you currently have, and hope that it was as helpful as we found it in listening to it. We always learn from our presenters, our experts. So thank you so much, Dr. Green, for being here with us today. Really appreciate what you have shared. So important for the work we're doing right now. And you have the information on how to contact both Dr. Green and those of us here at SPP-TAP. I thank everyone for their time today. Really appreciate your efforts. I know this is trying times, and wonderful that you can be here. Again, enjoy the rest of your day, and please do reach out if there's more that we can do. Thank you.